Hey everybody, welcome to Field of Dreams on ACTN. I'm Steve David and I'm your host. Today I have three super panelists who is going to help me discuss what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about Black Lives Matter. Why? You know, is everything that happens in America usually shifts to Trinidad. So we want to get a jump ahead of talking about that in our way, in Trinidad and Tobago way, because obviously we a lot different to that scenario. Let me introduce the panel. Narada Wilson, welcome to the set, Narada.
Yes, Steve, always a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the opportunity again.
And next to Narada is Larry Joseph. Welcome to the set, Larry.
Thanks again, Steve. Always a pleasure.
And we have Jefferson George. Welcome to the set, Jefferson.
Thank you, Steve. Always a pleasure. Great to be here.
I always wanted to know if Jefferson was the first name and George was the last or the first name. So George is the last name and Jefferson is the first name.
That's right.
All right. So that is two first names like Steve David, two first names. Yeah? Larry
right.
Joseph, no. Okay. All right, viewers,
A community spreader.
we talked about last week in our conversation, guys, in our conversation, we talked about FIFA want to take us back to the dark ages and all that kind of good stuff or bad stuff. And we wasn't ready to get there and all of that. Now, and it dawned on me, you know, we never really sit down and talk about issues like Black Lives Matter and changes that we hope that would, things that we hope would change. In Trinidad and Tobago, we don't really have the black-white racial stuff, but we have some issues here that we probably will talk about as well. But it's like I am looking at what can we do as not us, but what can the nation do to change things? You know, you look at the election that happened, and it was, again, the racial black Indian thing, or African Indian, however you want to put it, thing worked out, you know, happened, and it continues beyond. And growing up or playing football, my favorite player was Bobby Sukram. He was Indian. It didn't matter. And Vernon Sadafel, and we had Vernon Sadafel, Ellis Sadafel, Terry Ali, a bunch of Indian didn't play a lot of football, but the ones who were special came and played football, you know, and it was supposed to be Indian was supposed to be playing cricket and all of that. But I don't want to get to the Indian African issue. I want us to talk about the discrimination that happened, that we go through here, and so on. Point Fortin was the most discriminated area that I ever known as a kid, but it didn't affect us. We all played together as kids. But when you look at how the whole area was structured, is Clifton Hill was where the senior staff or the white people from England who worked at Shell lived. And then Mahaika was the junior staff where the middle class kind of lived. And then it came to us who lived in T-shirt Village, where all the weekly paid or hourly paid workers lived. So that is how it was. And we lived in it and we enjoyed it. And if I was to change that, or they asked me if I was to reincarnate and come again, I wouldn't want to change that. I would want to do the same thing. And me and Warren Archibald had lots of conversation on that because he reminded me about things that happened in football. I'm talking about with Shell Coles when he was not a Shell Coles player, but he used to come and Doyle Griffith used to carry on the sessions. I wasn't in that yet, but Doyle Griffith carried on the sessions. And the way he got onto the team was he was playing, he was at the sideline while a game was going on, or a practice game was going on. And then Tony Reyes, who was a captain, call him Cap, High Cap, he was a captain, he had to go out. And he came off the field, and Archie said when he saw that, he just ran onto the field and started playing. And then he was so good that Doyle noticed him. But on that team, they had a lot of the senior staff and junior staff, kids with a few, maybe one or two of the hourly paid workers. So like I said, I was brainstorming to my own self-brainstorming, and to find out, to check myself and see how does it relate and how does it compare with what's happening in the U.S. and with other things. I mean, there was so much. So I wanted us to just sit down and rap about that and talk about if we ever had these issues happen or things happen to us, and share some experiences and enlighten our viewers to some of the things that we've been through over the years, and maybe what can help make a change in their mind, like we tried to do last week with FIFA trying to push things down our throat, and we were accepting it, and we wanted to change the trend of thought to let them know that, hey, this can't happen. So, like I said, barbershop discussion, let's wrap about that and talk about these kind of things. So I'll open it up to Narada.
Yeah, no
You
problem.
the guy who wants to go?
No, there's no problem. I can
Or is
take
it
it.
Larry on this, or is it Jefferson?
Open the ball in there.
Huh?
Yeah, Narada Bowl.
Yeah, no, it's an issue that I think all of us probably have experienced in some way, form, or fashion throughout your lives. I think what is very, visual, at least in Trinidad and Tobago, or at least across the world in most cases, is the institutionalization of said, acts of racism or experiences. I was privy to, speak to some persons down Point Fortin as well to see how that form in some way of segregation, showed itself. It's something that is, it's good to have the knowledge. You see just in one community or one area, how based on where you were on a employment status determined more or less where you lived and grew up and probably the benefits or amenities that you had access to. Today, in some cases, we still have it, but I think, it is very, very much prevalent there. You saw it. You could actually see it based on the structure of the houses, the communities, what they had access to. Thankfully, today, a lot of it has been removed, and you see persons, you more or less could live wherever you want based on your economic, standing or where you think you're worth to make that expense. But it's what was good is that you all, as kids, sometimes you weren't necessarily seeing it so much because, playing of football and some of these sports tend to incorporate a lot of persons. But what I would say, and it's been very much reflective in sport and from the experience that I have had, is that on the field, there's a representation of society, so to speak. So we may have, 50%, 75% players, being black or being, the majority in a particular, country. But then when we go up the management level, the ownership level, we tend to not see the same representation. So recently I was, reading something that said, for example, in using the NBA, 75% of the players would be black. And then we could say, okay, cool, because maybe 75% of black persons probably play the sport or just in general play the sport in the States are black. But then when we go up to ownership, coaching, it's not the same amount, even though a lot of these players would transition into coaching. So if 75% of your players are black, then almost everybody goes into coaching after. How come it's not 75% of the coaches may be coaches of teams? You know, the opportunity isn't equal to them. And then we could still go down, but it's not even 50%, you know. So that's where the problem is. And then when we go to ownership, we're not even seeing 20% being minorities, even though a lot, you know, you're talking about 80% of the players are minority players. And I think even in Trinidad, you know, to some extent, we see that reflected in terms of what I think is our kind of level of discrimination, so to speak, is yes, we have two predominantly larger race groups, ethnicities. We divide it to some extent by the sport we play. However, all of us grew up playing these sports together, you know, but then it sort of divides. So I think it's somewhere along our growing up that there's this pivotal moment that we haven't grasped, put our hands on, to address what is happening there. Why is it more persons of the Afro-Trinbagonian descent tend to go to football, and why those of the Indo-Trinbagonian descent go to another sport? Or why those of the other ethnicities tend to not be reflected equally as in society in sport in Trinidad and Tobago?
Jeff Bowley second over now.
All right. Interesting discussion, and again, no, it's I think it's very pertinent. It's an issue that is before eyes almost every day.
Yeah.
Right, and my take on it from a personal standpoint is, while doing my own reflections, you get to understand your own sense of privilege, right? As players playing in sport, whatever sport it might be, because as our ethnic grouping, we are marginalized. That is not something that you can hide in other spheres. In sports, you are allowed to go get what you have to get, basically, right? There's no ceiling set for you. You would be supported actually by your community, by your school, by your country to do the best that you can do. There is no ceiling for you in sports. And that has been my reality. Now, again, somebody who goes into another field, let's say economics or banking, some type of business, right? That ceiling is set for them very early on, right? And after my my playing days, that is when, for me, I experienced, that proverbial ceiling. You can't go above this, right? There's going to be heavy resistance to that, and I think that taught me something, because a lot of the times you would have people, wanting to, cast aspersions against others who didn't seem to achieve what you expect them to achieve, or what they can achieve, what society would ask of them to achieve, not understanding the limitations that are set on them by society itself. Take, for example, growing up, my passion was always sports. I started out in athletics. I was an athlete, run track, and again, from school, you would always have the support of your teachers, your classmates, what have you, right? Somebody who is probably not gifted as an athlete, they have to strive now for academia, right? Straight. And when they are in that trend or in that flow, they are going to find that ceiling way before I do, right? Because they are going in a path that for them, that path is not as clear, it's not as well charted, and they would not have the support that I would have because I am in sports, So, and that's something that I think is relevant to the whole discussion as we go forward?
Yeah, I suppose the bowling change now, they bring on the spinner, right? Well, because of where I grew up in Trinidad and in South, I wasn't faced with any sort of huge racial discrimination because for us in Trinidad, we basically, in my area, we were basically black people. You had a few sprinkling of East Indian between us. And everybody in my growing up days just seemed to live happy with everyone. I mean, and there wasn't any contrasting view during those early developmental years that suggested to me that it was not so. So all I knew growing up is that everybody lived happily wherever we were. And sport broke down whatever little it had even more. So that I grew up really and truly not knowing or grasping or understanding about racial discrimination in any very forceful way. I didn't meet it until as an adult. And as an adult, it was when you started to be exposed to newspapers and television and bigger people and then politicians. And then you started to realize, well, you know, life is not as simple as you thought growing up. There are some things that were different about some people, and there are some people who like to highlight these differences in a negative way. And that's when I started to take note as an adult. But growing up, like Jeff, I mean, most of my time was taken up in sport. Of course, life was much simpler back then. You had school, you had church, you had sports. That was our life growing up, right? And everything revolved around it. And if you were good at playing sport, in my case was football, that consumed most of your life. So even though you was in school, it's football you're playing. When you're home, it's football you're playing. You know, you're in church where you're starting to go and play football. So racial discrimination, as we know it now, was not something that I grew up being in the midst of and having to make decisions based on my race or somebody's race, or somebody prevented me because I didn't belong to their race and that kind of thing. You know, fast forward to now, and it's a completely different world in which we live in. Even the whole question locally of East Indian versus African has become more pronounced than when I was growing up. And then we're exposed because of technology now where you have the racial discrimination with blacks against white in the outside world. And so that has come to bear into our environment now and that kind of thing. So you're almost being forced to make a decision sometimes based on race. Even though it's not part of you, sometimes you are put into a corner where you have to make a decision based on race. And that's been difficult. For me, I have to resist that inclination all the time, even though it's a reality that I live in. You know, having traveled a little bit and been exposed a little bit too, because as sportsmen, we are also insulated from some of the harsh realities of racial discrimination. In some cases, not in all, because as we see what's happening with some of the black athletes in America and in England, they have to, even though they've been popular and well-known and rich, they are still faced with it because that's in their environment. Locally, we don't have it that bad. We still have it, of course, right? And for me, fortunately, if I may say so, I have not really had to deal with it in a confrontational way because I spend most of my time in Trinidad and we still don't really have, we have a little teeth and tongue with East Indians and African, but I have not been in a position where I've had to, confront it. Like, had to tell my East Indian friend, hey, whatever, I haven't had to deal with it in a confrontational way, even though it's a reality that we live in.
Okay, guys, let's take a break. When we come back, we will pick up where Larry left off. Viewers, we'll be right back after the short break.
call me what you want anyway, right? But that would not affect me. I know who I am. I know my worth, right? And that was done by my parents. Saying so, because of the...
Okay, welcome back, viewers. Yeah, like we were saying, you know, I don't see it now, but there was a time when even clubs used to be racially divided or whatever. When what I mean is we had, and we still have, Queen's Park. And you had to be either light skin, black, and we do some discrimination even within ourselves with the color, light skin, or some kind of look. I don't want to think some kind of look to, or status to be in certain clubs like Harvard, Queen's Park, but it never happened down in my area, like Larry was saying, down in Point, because we all blackhead chicken running around trying to live. We all drink our bush tea and eat cricks, and I'm glad that I had to go through that and understand survival. And then you went to the U.S. I mean, you get put on a pedestal because you're a professional athlete, and you can have everything that you want in front of you, but you still think about the ones who don't have that privilege. And you know, you get the privilege to do things or rub shoulders with people who in so-called upper status only because your ability to play a sport. And I'm sure it happens here too. So I mean, I lived a lot of my life in the U.S., so I'm just talking based on that. But every time I come home, I mean, it's the same. It seems like I remember back in the day, we come and we do our thing together and we just roll. So tell me about some of the things that you guys have encountered here based on discrimination.
Well, I think, you know, you touched on something, you know, when you named a couple of the institutions. Again, it goes back to some sort of institutionalized discrimination, if I could put it that way. Because a privilege that a lot of us have is the fact that we went to what we consider prestigious schools. That is like the start of everything in Trinidad, you know, depending on, and it starts from even a very young age, because now they have primary schools or whatever, that there was a point in time, persons who were getting into these schools, it's maybe because of some family, some connection that you would have had, and that more or less is the start of where things go from there. And the small privilege that we have that sometimes we don't recognize is that going to one of the prestigious secondary schools, or so-called what we put these titles on, opens the door to you. But what you're not seeing is what would have happened had you not gone to these schools and you lived the same life that you wanted. You were a good footballer, not going to a prestige school. Would you have ended up whether in a good club, at the national team setup, based on who was the manager or the coach at the time? And life could have been totally different. Today, you know, yes, of course, we have 80% of our population is what we consider black, whether you group Afro and Indo-Trinbagonians together, you know. They're what would be the minority in Europe or in the States. But inside that, why we divide ourselves is because if I go to a prestige school, it opens a pathway to me. So if I reach in a room with persons who are of a smaller percentage in ethnicity, who are in the upper class, it's based on, oh, there's some sort of common ground that we stand on because of the education that we acquired. And that alone in itself says something. And you always have to put yourself in the shoes of, if this didn't happen, or why don't we take on the problems of persons in communities where the schools are not, or went to schools that are not prestigious, or so to speak. You know, they have, I was fortunate to go in a couple of them when I would speak, and some basic things that I had in my school, you know, they're deprived of and I am, you know, then it lends to why in 5, 10 years, they may not have their foot in the door the same way I might have had my foot in the door, simply because of where they were afforded to study. And that alone in itself is where it starts here. And then, in the same clubs that you may call, or what over the years have been seen as those clubs, you were probably there based on some sort of good standing that your parents may have had. You know, I, for example, went to one of these clubs and I played there. And I remembered for a short period being there, and my parents weren't in the organization, but it's because of me rubbing shoulders with school friends who may have been there that I was able to access, and then that I studied abroad and all this sort of things. So you realize that is the reason why you were in that clique, opposed to if that didn't happen just based on your natural talent. So I think, you know, that's where our divide starts to some extent, and starts to rear its head.
And I mean, it happens to us all the time, and we just roll through it. So should we continue living like rolling through this, or should we do like in America now? It's like everything is looked at through a microscope, trying to say, you're picking on me because I am this or because I am that. You know, what's going to work? I mean, because it's getting ridiculous.
Yeah.
Well, I grew up in Princeton, right? I think it's the best place that I could have, you know, have a start. My parents obviously provided a strong foundation in terms of instilling in us that value and self-worth. I know who I was. You can call me what you want anywhere, right? But that would not affect me. I know who I am. I know my worth, right? And that was done by my parents. Saying so, because of the ethnic mix in that Princeton area, there is, you know, a lot of Indians and Negroes together. So it's something that I'm accustomed to, right? They're accustomed to me. I have never had a bad experience doing that. Going to school, we were always together, you know, Indian and Negroes as normal, right? Obviously, there would be those who would be a little more difficult to get along with, and so on. But that was how it was from primary school all the way up through senior sec. For matter example, 2 days ago, a young lady now, right? She was in primary school together with me all through and so on. And just last week, I was telling my wife about when we were driving through the area. And for some reason, she's not on Facebook and stuff like that. Somebody contacted me saying that she wanted to get in contact with me. And she works on a rig now in Denmark. And this Indian girl was telling him, you know, about how close, you know, we were and stuff like that. And for that would be almost 30 years, right? that we were getting in touch for the first time. And I mean, things like that shows that the divide that is placed among us is a political one mostly, and that divide that is created for some sort of separation. Steve mentioned even within a particular ethnic group, you have different separations based on person's class, their financial status, and things like that. And again, we cannot pretend like we don't know how that came about, right? That was done. We were taught to hate ourselves, right? The same group, the Black Lives Matter, if you look at their, and again, let me just, full disclosure, I believe in the statement and the cause. I do not wholly support the movement, right? I tend to look at things from a very broad view, and there are a lot of things that I believe they are about that I cannot be about, right? I look at what is driving the organization, who is funding the organization, things like that, and those things are very conflicted, right? You have a lot of, and I'm not going away from the original point, but just to set my base here, every group that has been created to so-called address that ethnic division coming out of the US, of course, has been started, and they have been groups to manage the Negro population, right? They've not done anything else, right? The NAACP, which was founded in early 1900, 1904 or something like that. And you had the Urban League, which was founded in probably 1910, 1908. Those groups have been there ever since. They still exist today, but we were protesting and you know, marching for civil rights in 65. You understand? 68, Martin Luther King was assassinated. You know what I mean? So these groups, I don't believe in them. Same way, Black Lives Matter, they come up, right? Again, the cause is a just cause, right? The statement Black Lives Matter is so obvious that, you know, the reason we have to say that Black Lives Matter shows that there's an issue there, right? And that divide that has been created by a white superiority complex has been forced on us, and even among ourselves now we begin to splinter because we are looking for, up on the other, right? And that is where that has come about from, right? So that's my platform there. But again, for me in Trinidad and Tobago, I cannot, to be honest, find a situation where I was disenfranchised in sport because of any ethnic difference or things like that. And that's why I'm saying I acknowledge that to be a form of privilege because of where I was in sports. If you have quality in sports, if you can do a particular thing, if you bring value, then people overlook the skin that you're in, where that will not apply in other situations. We talked about the color and so on, and these are things that we can miss today because of not knowing what we went through. In the 70s, to work in a bank, to be a teacher, things like that, you needed to, one, straighten your hair. You could not have natural hair. Having natural hair or wearing an afro was that was a rebellious kind of mark. You know, you had to blend in to look as much as the persons who were ruling. Right, you look like Larry.
That's
right?
right.
With straightened hair.
That's
you know,
right.
Yeah.
I mean, we skip over these things because today it doesn't apply. Today you wear afro because it's a style.
Yeah.
Right? And again, that is progress, but the system that was set up by these white superior people, or people who believe that they were superior, they're still in place. And that's why organizations like the Black Lives Matter exist, right? And for me, I think we, through proper education, through trying to, again, teach our children most of all, because again, my background and my foundation came from, my parents. And I think that's important.
Yeah. It's the same with me in my growing up time, as I mentioned earlier. And in school, in primary school and in secondary school, for me, my best friends were East Indians. I mean, and I didn't even see them as an East Indian talking about it now. They were just my classmate. The whole question of the hair being different and I being different never occurred to me or even to them. Even up to now, we are still very, very good friends because of that foundation that we had from in school, right? Maybe we were naive, but that naivety was a good thing, I would suggest, because it made us appreciate the other person for simply being a human being. And we got along because of the amount of things we had in common as against what our differences may be, and it's only when we became adults and we started to have to now live amongst the adults and things like politics started to be something we had to get involved in, if only to listen to the politician. That's when I started to realize that there was a different language being spoken than what I was accustomed to. And more so along the lines of what was different about the other person rather than what made us common. And because I didn't live in a bubble, it affected me, you know, not somewhat, it affected me a little bit, you know, and it is only because of my strong belief in God, and that allowed me to see through the lens of a spiritual being that says that all people were created equal in God's eyes. And even though we have these physical differences, maybe by skin color and hair texture, at the end of the day, everybody is equal in God's eyes. It's just on earth we bring the divisions and the separation by status and finances and color and all these kind of things, right? I still maintain a very healthy relationship with anybody that I have come in contact with. I'm not naive. I understand the differences that we have and I exist in based on race, based on class. I understand all these things, right? But I do not allow it to drive me to make decisions that would affect my relationship with other people. There are times because of that, I have to stand off. And there are times because of it, I have to confront. But I do so based on a certain amount of understanding, a certain amount of patience. There are times when I have to do it with a lot of impatience, because I'm a human being and I'm flesh, and sometimes I react because of those things. But fortunately for me, I must say, and by extension, all of us in Trinidad, we have never really had to face, and more so in the South, had to face some of those real confrontational racial issues that maybe some of the people in the North would have experienced, and then out in the outer world where you have America and UK, and in Europe where you have that more prominent white versus black issue, you know. So I'm looking on the outside into these people's culture, and if I just narrow it down to football, and we talk about football, in England, for instance, I remember having a discussion with one John Barnes, who is considered a legend in the English game, but he's black. You know, when John Barnes was to say to me, Larry, I can't even get an interview to go coach for a 4th division team in England. I like, John, you have to be kidding. You can't be telling me that. Use John Barnes. He said, yeah, I'm telling you straight. I can't get an interview to go and coach a 4th division team. Now, he did get a chance with a couple. I know he coached Celtic. It probably lasted as long as 6 months. And the only reason he got the job is because Kenny Dalglish was there. And Kenny Dalglish was his coach at Liverpool. Right? But the point is taken, and it is highlighted even more so now, even in these modern times, with players like Raheem Sterling and all these black guys who have been, even in spite of their fame and fortune and popularity, still have to deal with the institutionalized racialism that the culture they live in throws at them all the time, that negates their status as star sportsmen. You know, when you hear fellas like Ian Wright and them telling you how they have been stopped numerous times by police simply because of what they drove and the color of their skin. You know, institutionalized racism says to the powers that be that a certain color should not be driving a certain vehicle or living in a certain place. And so when these things occur, then the racial divide is pronounced, and you see it, and you know, that's why we're having this discussion here, because even in America and UK, it is filtered down into our situation in Trinidad simply because of how small the global village has become. Yeah.
Okay, let's take a break, and we'll be right back. Viewers, we'll be right back.
Because I went to school, yes, I went to one of what they consider the prestige schools in Port of Spain, and I had friends who lived in some.
Okay, welcome back. So, based on all that we've discussed now, let's bring it back to football. When we get on the football field, none of that matters. So, or any sport we play, none of that matters. So, it's obvious when we were younger, none of that matters. We didn't care, we didn't know. So this is a taught
Behavior.
thing. And as you grow up, we grow into something that we really not. So it's the adults that pushing us down, obviously. So how can we eliminate this kind of stuff? Because we go through, as we grow older, we get into that. And like I said to you guys before, I like to, don't judge me as a black man, judge me as a man, and I would compete for whatever I need to compete, whether based on as a man, not because I'm a minority or and give me any privileges. Judge me on that, but give me a fair share. And is that happening? And we obviously is no, it's not. So how can that change? Let's talk about solutions that we think solutions to this problem. What can change that?
Well, yeah, as you touched on that, something that I realized, yes, any sort of racism, racial divide is taught or learned behavior. What I think is the answer, and it's something that has been brought up in front of me on a couple of occasions, is actually opportunity. There was a point in time when I went abroad to Brazil to study the earlies. I would probably be the only black person in class, and even though Brazil is 51% claimed to be black, so that means they consider themselves with some sort of percentage to be black. It was not a reflection in a public or government university or whatever. And, I would have lecturers who are black, and they would bring up the topic. And I would always feel a little uncomfortable because they speak about it. I'm the only person here. Everybody else is watching me in a class of about 30 kids or whatever. But one of the things they had was a law that they changed where blacks were permitted a certain percentage to get into the universities. And I was against it. I thought, why would you do that? You're kind of saying that we need a lower bar to get in and blah, blah, blah. And I was a little angry in the class. And then the lecturer, after the class, he pulled me aside and he said, if they work the menial jobs, they go to schools that are deprived funding and they don't get the best schools. All these kids whose parents have middle class and upper middle class lifestyles and jobs go to private schools where they get the best education, and then they take up the space in public schools after they write like SATs or whatever. Then they automatically become doctors, lawyers, or whatever the case is. The black kid is not getting in because his economic background doesn't afford him a good primary school or secondary school that could afford him the education to get in. If we lower the bar, it's not about saying he isn't capable enough. It's giving him the opportunity where if 100 get in, yeah, maybe 10 might fall aside, and then maybe 60 or 70 will now get their degrees and probably live in a life where they could have some sort of middle class or upper middle class lifestyle. And that's when I thought about it, it kind of stuck with me that it's really opportunity. Because I went to school, yes, I went to one of what they consider the prestige schools in Port of Spain, and I had friends who lived in some what we consider at-risk areas who basically had to not put their address to go to whatever primary school they went to give them a good education to get to that school. Or when they got jobs, they couldn't put that, even with their degrees, that they lived in this area because that somehow would affect the human resource prospects of him getting in. And, friends who lived in those areas would tell me, I had 50 friends who went primary school with me together. At secondary school, it kind of changed where I went to a prestige school, the others didn't, and then slowly they fell aside, and it was all because parents couldn't afford to send them to school every day. They were living in this area, this happened, that happened, and I realized it's just opportunity. If you get the opportunity, just as on the football field, the fact that when you were growing up is that playing football, you were given the opportunity to play. Nobody said, your parents didn't hold you back and say, oh, because you're this race, you can't play that sport. So once we get the opportunity, or persons get the opportunity fairly, it's now down to them to show if they can or can't do it. But if you're not given the opportunity, if I can't get a job, as you use the John Barnes story, he's qualified, he has all the prerequisites, but he's not given the opportunity, so we can't even say if he deserves to be there or not. Somebody else has the same qualification, different ethnicity, gets the opportunity. So sometimes we see some of these prominent players, whether we go with Lampard, this, that, the other, they're given the opportunity, so we can sit back and say whether he's good or not. but the other guys not even given the opportunity, and that's where the problem starts. So I think for me, that's where it starts.
It look like you watching Larry, Larry watching you,
and Larry looking away.
Yeah.
Right. I jump in. I'm glad you brought it to this, like, what do we do? Because I think that is the conversation that we need to be having, right? Not whether or not it exists, because as Steve said, it exists. People like to pretend it does not, and that does not fix the problem.
Correct.
All right? And the thing about it is, I think what will help is if we take it back to the origins, right? The idea that, and I mentioned this last week as well, the idea that God created different races on the face of the earth is a created idea. It's very late, actually. That's not something that the early peoples had,
Correct.
right? That didn't exist, right? I would call, my Indian friends Indians. Why? Because they came from India, right? That's where they originated. That's a geological term, right? That you can reference that. They know where they came from. Us as Negroes, you need to be us to understand not knowing where you came from. You have to research that, and in some cases, it's almost impossible. That is a big issue because somebody, for some reason, let's say the reason, for economic benefit, moved you from where you were and cut you off from everything that you knew. Created a culture that they said was yours, so that even people who are of other ethnic races who did not create the system or the structure would refer to you in a way that ties you back to that slavery. Right. Every time. It happened in just after the elections there, what those who were getting out of themselves was talking about. You are a slave and you're this and you're that, right? You're a monkey or so on. Who did that, right? The white supremacists taught us that. They taught us to hate ourselves. That's why our young women putting extensions in the hair, they're calling their faces all kind of color, because why? They don't trust this skin that they're in. Mm-hmm. Somebody didn't tell them that this is beautiful, right? And how do you fix that? You fix that by educating them, right? We did not start out there, right? There was a whole history before we were enslaved, before we were kidnapped. And that's why you need to call this. This was the worst atrocity that was done, right, on planet Earth for the longest period that it was done to an ethnic group. The longest. And up till this day, nobody has paid for it. Nobody. Not a soul. So when NAACP comes and Urban, whoever, and Black Lives Matter, unless they begin to talk about that, I know that they're not really addressing the real issue, right? From my standpoint, as I said, I have 2 boys and a girl, and for me, I instill them every day. There's nothing wrong with you. There's absolutely nothing wrong with you. You put, you set your bar where you want it to be, right? And at the end of the day, you work towards that, right? I also don't give them the false premise that this world is friendly to you, because it is not, right? The same order that was put in place, Negroes are put at the bottom, and everybody else knows that, right? We can't pretend like, and that's what comes out when people get angry and people want to throw stuff at you. Everybody know that, you're at the bottom, right? But that, again, has been a system that was created. That is not true, and we have to now teach and re-educate ourselves properly. And if we don't do that, we will always find ourselves in problems. One of the best responses on the field that I've seen to racism was the Dani Alves. Right. When in Europe, they throw bananas on the field, at your banana peels, they make monkey chants and so on. And he was playing one of the games while he was still at Barcelona. Right. He was at the corner flag close to the crowd, and somebody threw a banana peel, you know. He took up the banana, he ate it. Banana. Yeah, he took the banana, he ate it, and then do his thing, score. you know. And now, at the end of the day, I'm not saying that is easy because it's difficult. Mario Balotelli will give you his, I mean, there's so much pain in his football. That's why he operates how he operates. He's playing for a country where, even while you're playing for your own country, they would have placards on your clubs, saying that, there are no black Italians, that type of thing. That would be written on the way when he's driving to the stadium, And the only how you can really deal with that as an individual, rather such as some of the things that states and federal bodies have a responsibility, of course, but we as individuals can't address that. We have to do what we have to do, right? Set up yourself, prepare your mind for that battle, because that's what it is. It's a battle in your mind, not allowing yourself to be restricted by standards or barriers that are placed on you. Knowing that my fight is going to be harder than everybody else because they are actually putting limitations on you. And if you start off knowing that, my fight is going to be hard, but guess what? I prepare myself and I go out there, and as Steve said, I go in to show you. You understand? I come to do this. And no one can stop me.
Well said, Jeff. Well said. I really appreciate some of the things you said there. So true. But racism is an institutionalized culture, right? For something to be institutionalized, it means that persons or people over a period of time have to decide this is what we want this to look like, and let's sell that narrative, whichever method they plan to use. Black on white racism, as we know, came from the false belief and philosophy of the white man that they were the superior race on earth. And the black man was not even considered to be human, even though he had 2 foot and 2 hands and 2 eyes like them. But he was less than a human and was considered an animal. And so we can use them for fodder, for profit. And it became institutional because every generation that came both from the Western and the European side of the world, they believed that that is what the black people represented. To be used, to be enslaved, to be servants, to be less than, right? And unfortunately for us on this side of the Atlantic, because we came from within that enslaved culture, even as Jeff says, he has to do with his children. We have to reinforce in our generations that this is what you're going to meet, right? But this is the reality. This is what is true. Because racism being an institutionalized thing is really a false narrative. It's a false reality. But if that's all you know, it's your reality. If you're not told that it's false, you'll believe it's a real reality. And I would say, fortunately for us in Trinidad here, because we didn't really have the white and black per se as in the North American side of things, right? We didn't really have to confront it early, but it has come home to roost because the world is so small now. For me, as a solution to anything that is institutionalized, that is, we consider to be morally wrong, which racism is, right? It's all about freeing yourself, firstly, from being as an individual enslaved to that institution. So for me, when I understood, based on spiritual ethics, what freedom really meant, that freed me from that institutionalized racism. That didn't hold any strings. It didn't bind me to its concept anymore. And I was able now, as an individual, to see people through the lens as what I believe God wanted us to see everybody. So before I saw a white man, I saw a man, somebody made by God. Before I saw a black man, I saw somebody that God created. Before I saw an Indian person, I saw somebody who God created. And that has been my solution to the institutionalized racism that exists all over now. I choose to see people firstly as God's creation and treat them from that perspective first. Am I denying, am I being naive that racism exists? Of course not. But my response is not going to be a racist response or in response to racism. In matter of fact, it is a response to racism, but it is not what the status quo says I should respond like. You know, and it has allowed me to create and build bridges where before maybe there was not any at all, to start a conversation where maybe the status quo would have said that, don't have a conversation there. And it has allowed me to appreciate God's creation in a holistic way, that I am not bound in a narrow, compartmentalized place where I react to everything in a certain way, as we see happening now in America, as the case may be. And at the same time, I want to make this point. I am totally against. I'm abhorred. I hate it when I see racism in any form. In any form. And I will do everything within my individual powers to ensure that I don't support it, but I speak out against it.
You said it all, Larry. Thanks. Thank you guys for being here. Narada, Larry, Jefferson, appreciate you. Viewers, thanks for watching. Every Monday night, and we do repeat on a Tuesday. We have a Facebook page. You can check us out. And we have an email address, feederdreamstt@gmail.com, where you can drop us a line. The show's ended. Go in peace. My name is Steve David. Good night.